Thank you, Bob. And I want to echo the message of gratitude to the organizing committee for inviting me to be part of this conference again. It's terrific to be back in Zurich, and a true honor to be part of the esteemed panel of speakers here today and tomorrow. For neurotic folks like myself, it's always a relief when you're asked to give a talk on a topic that's relatively straight away and free of any controversy. So you can imagine how delighted I was when I was asked to talk about insurance testing. I guess I lost that coin flip, Michael. That being our assignment, our writing group was charged with the combined task of conducting a critical review of the literature over the last 30 years or so on tools or tests that are used in the diagnosis or assessment of concussion. Michael has given you a terrific overview of the sideline assessment tools, and what I hope to do in the next 15 minutes is to give you a very brief overview of the results from our critical review on the use of computerized neurocognitive tests. Before we jump into the computerized tests themselves, let's provide perhaps a helpful backdrop on the acute cognitive effects and recovery following sport-related concussion. Now recognized as really the hallmark, one of the hallmarks of concussion, and one of the domains of functional capacity that is most sensitive to alteration after acute concussion. Several fairly large prospective studies have demonstrated this in recent years. This is work from Kevin Guskowitz and our group in the initial NCAA concussion study, indicating that in a concussed group relative to normal controls, and here the x-axis is the longitudinal course of time from preseason baseline, time of concussion, post-game or post-practice, which is 2 to 3 hours later, day 1, day 2, day 3, etc. And using a brief cognitive screening tool like the SAC, there is a significant decline in cognitive ability as measured quantitatively by the SAC and other tools like it within minutes after injury. But then there's a fairly rapid or gradual course of recovery within even the first 2 to 3 hours and continues over the first several days. Several studies have since replicated that finding. Grant Iverson has done a terrific job of illustrating the results of several meta-analytic studies by himself, Heather Belanger, and others, indicating that indeed there is a very robust signal of cognitive decline evident within the first 24 hours of injury, which is our area of focus this afternoon. But the other half of the equation is that that signal diminishes quite rapidly within the first week. The challenge as a test developer is to develop tools and instruments that are not only robust in detecting this strong signal within the earliest phase after injury, but one that would have lasting sensitivity or signal detection abilities that track recovery over time further out from injury. When we focus our discussion today on the 24-hour period or the day of injury, you'll see again, work from Steve Grolio and others has illustrated that fairly large effect sizes in cognitive functioning and decline, but somewhat dwarfed by the effect sizes on symptom scales and clinical balance testing that Michael reviewed for you a minute ago. It's that heavy, hot pursuit of signal detection that really was the birth and a new era of cognitive testing, the movement toward computerized neurocognitive assessment tools. And the neuropsychologists in the community are aware of the fact that this movement is not restricted to the concussion work. This is going on in dementia, in stroke, in multiple sclerosis, in clinical trials, and other settings in which cognitive testing has been utilized. Maybe the signal detection hasn't been as good as we wanted it to be, or other situational constraints moved us toward the development of computerized platforms. But as it relates to the sports world, there were a number of presumptive advantages to the use of computers over our traditional paper and pencil neurocognitive tests. One is that we could baseline test athletes in larger groups rather than one-on-one via technician and athlete. That would also enable wider dissemination beyond the boundaries of where most neuropsychologists practice, largely in metropolitan or suburban areas. And that's led to some believing that this can be carried out without the need for a neuropsychologist to be involved at all. Those were the practical advantages. On the clinical side, or the signal detection side, it was also assumed that these tests would give us better signal detection, greater sensitivity in identifying sometimes those very subtle changes in cognitive functioning that our traditional tests were not sensitive to provide automated statistical analyses of the results that could then generate, for instance, clinical reports that could be used for return-to-play decision-making. Our group was charged with the assignment of conducting a critical review of the literature to determine what does the science say about the advent and utility of computerized testing. Before I jump into the science, I thought I'd just briefly highlight this paper from about a year ago by Don Comstock and colleagues. This is on the use of computerized testing for the assessment of sport-related concussion in high schools in America. They had a very high response rate to their survey of certified athletic trainers, indicating that about 40% of high schools at that time had already employed the use of computerized neurocognitive testing. Impact is a tool that had the overwhelming lion's share of the market in the United States at least. And that 86% of those schools were using the test both at baseline and post-injury. 100% of the schools that had adopted computerized testing said that they were using it as one component of their return-to-play decision-making. Most often, the computerized test results were interpreted by either a certified athletic trainer or a physician, and less than 20% of the time was a neuropsychologist involved. So the message here is that this horse has already left the barn. There is widespread use of computerized testing in the United States. I'm less familiar with how much penetration there has been in other countries, but it has been adopted by a large segment of the clinical professionals, certified athletic trainers and others, for the assessment of sport-related concussion in the U.S. So our group was, again, charged with this critical review. We conducted a computerized literature search of Medline, PubMed, the Signal Library, PsycInfo, and Cochrane Library on all published literature over the last 30 years, ranging from 1982 through near the end of 2012. We applied various mesh terms that are consistent with other systematic reviews that have been done on sport-related concussion in the past. We had several additional requirements for a study to be included in our analyses. That is, it had to be have been published in English. It represented original research. It involved the use of computerized testing with data collected within 24 hours of the concussion, and obviously these were human studies, not animal models. So we have compiled this extensive review, organizing our findings by domain, cognitive functioning, balance tests, QEEG, others. The focus of today, obviously, is on the utility of computerized cognitive tests. A couple disclosures. This was not intended as a comprehensive review of the psychometric properties of these instruments. And it also did not, because our focus was day of injury assessment, or as it was assigned to us, day of injury diagnoses, we did not conduct an extensive review of these tools and their utility in assessing follow-up and tracking recovery or return-to-play decision-making. So I also want to recognize the members of our writing team, Grant Iverson, Ruben Echemendia, Michael McPhee, who's here, and Martin Raftery, who is also in the room. All of those individuals are here and did a lot of heavy lifting in this literature review and writing assignment. So let's boil down what our computerized literature search revealed. We identified initially 577 potential articles based on the mesh terms, keywords. That was rapidly reduced down to 43 articles. Most were eliminated because they involved no data collection on day of injury. In total, there were 31 studies that involved cognitive testing, and 11 of those involved the use of computerized testing on day of injury. 5 of those studies included ANAM, a computerized test that has been used by the U.S. military and now in sports as well. CogSport or Axon Sports was used in 3 studies, Headminder in 1, and Impact in 3 additional studies. Here's just a very quick slate of the studies that qualified for our analyses, 11 in total. You can see the total number of concussed subjects across all studies was 574, and 107 control subjects, all of whom were athletes without sport-related concussion. These studies have been conducted not only using a variety of computerized tools, but it involves studies across mostly male athletes, a large number participating in American football, but also some in other sports such as ice hockey and some involving military cadets participating in boxing. So, for the short review purpose today, the punchline here is, what does our literature review tell us about how well we've improved our signal detection? And to summarize our findings, across the 11 studies, there was clear evidence of a significant decline from baseline and differences from normal controls within the first 24 hours after sport-related concussion on these computerized cognitive test tools. Not surprisingly, and quite consistent with the earlier literature from paper and pencil tests, the impairments were most often observed in cognitive processing speed, reaction time, working memory, complex attention, and new learning memory. There is some evidence that the computerized tools provide an interval advantage in identifying subjects who are otherwise claiming to be symptom-free. Somewhere between 15 to 30% of subjects in these studies were abnormal on computerized neurocognitive testing, while reporting that they were otherwise symptomatic and theoretically would be given the green light to return to play. On the other hand, much like the case of any clinical test that's out there, these computerized neurocognitive tests are not perfect. There were segments of these samples of athletes that were normal on neurocognitive testing, but still reporting significant post-concussive symptoms in the range of 10 to 25% of athletes involved in those studies. No studies specifically addressed our assigned question in terms of the ability of computerized neurocognitive test tools to, quote, diagnose concussion, perhaps rightfully so, as Paul has pointed out. One study compared the sensitivity of two computerized neurocognitive tools or tests, that in 2007 by Broglio and has been referenced in multiple talks here already today. It's a tribute to the work of Steve and the effort that he's put into. The standing joke in America is that Steve is a non-neuropsychologist and has contributed more to the literature on neurocognitive testing and sport-related concussion than any neuropsychologist has. And there were no studies that have specifically reported on the specificity of findings from these tools as it relates to sport-related concussion. Let's briefly look at the 2007 Broglio study, which does a nice job, I think, of illustrating the hits and misses of computerized neurocognitive testing. And this is a busy slide, but bear with me just for a second. So in this sample, 68% of the athletes were symptomatic on a concussion symptom checklist. 32% reported being asymptomatic within 24 hours of injury, not inconsistent with what earlier studies report. Then he compared a paper and pencil neuropsychological test battery, impact, and Headminder's CRI, Concussion Resolution Index, two computerized and one traditional battery, and also had a balance measure involved. And you'll see here that, as would be expected, that if you look at groups based on whether they're abnormal on the measure and symptomatic, or normal on the measure and symptomatic, you'll see that, as would be expected, the overwhelming majority of athletes who are still symptomatic are performing abnormally on the cognitive battery, whether that be paper and pencil or computerized. Again, in this case, giving objective evidence of impairment that supports the player's self-report. All of these measures also have a plus-up, or an interval value, in identifying abnormalities or deficits on cognitive testing in athletes who are otherwise reporting that they are symptom-free, and as I said, theoretically would be given the green light to return to activity. Anywhere from roughly 15 to 30% of athletes were identified on cognitive testing, but otherwise symptomatic. When you sum the hits from those batteries, you'll see that somewhere between roughly 65 and 90% sensitivity, if you will. And it has been pointed out earlier, as I mentioned, on the other hand, there are also some misses. Players that are reporting to be continued symptomatic, but have normal performance on these batteries, anywhere from 10 to 25% of them. The one important message here, I think, is that neurocognitive testing, computerized or conventional, will provide you with an advantage. You have to be aware of the possible misses, but if you want to maximize the power and the utility of your neurocognitive test, you use it in the context of a multidisciplinary, multimodal assessment battery. And Michael pointed this out earlier, that you take these sensitivity values and you raise them near the 90 to 95% level when you couple your neurocognitive test with a symptom inventory, with clinical balance testing, and that is the piece that is going to give you the greatest stability in advising your diagnostic decision. So a quick summary of our findings. There, again, is consistent with all the literature out there. There's clear evidence of not only subjective, but measurable changes in cognitive functioning during the acute phase after sport-related concussion. And within the first 24 hours, that effect size is quite robust. And there are a few studies in the literature that indicate the computerized neurocognitive testing on day of injury is able to identify and measure those acute changes in cognitive functioning. There's really minimal data out there on the sensitivity and specificity. The sensitivity of these computerized measures appears to be very similar to that of our conventional paper and pencil measures, notwithstanding some of the practical advantages. Again, there is a trade-off of increased sensitivity over symptom reporting, but also noting that these tests are not perfect litmus tests for the identification of the effects of concussion. We believe there was insufficient data to recommend a specific computerized neurocognitive test for clinical use. And again, we believe that these computerized neurocognitive tool tests, as is the case with any concussion test, is beneficial and most beneficial as part of a multidisciplinary, multimodal assessment approach. In the end, we believe there was a need for future research on the value of these tests, not only in terms of the acute assessment, but also their ability to predict athletes who might be at risk of prolonged recovery based on their acute performance. To that end, we are conducting right now a very large study in the United States funded by the U.S. Department of Defense that is a head-to-head comparison of 4 computerized neurocognitive assessment tools. Two that you'll recognize there, I'm sure, Axon Sports and Impact, who have been used widely in the sports world. ANAM is a battery that the U.S. military has been using for several years, and the DANA, the Defense Automated Neurobehavioral Assessment, is a new tool being developed by the U.S. Navy. We're conducting this independent head-to-head comparison of these 4 tools with multiple aims in mind. The aim of our study that is most germane to the discussion today about day of injury is studying the predictive validity of these computerized NCATs when administered within 24 hours of injury in predicting the time course of clinical recovery 8 days, 15 days, and 45 days after sport-related concussion. We're conducting a parallel study in civilians who come through the emergency department as well. So hopefully I'll be back next time to report on the results of that study, particularly as it relates to computerized testing. In response to our specific question that we were charged with, are computerized neurocognitive tests sensitive and reliable enough on day of injury to make or exclude a diagnosis of concussion? Our message will be completely consistent with that from Dr. McCrory and Dr. McDesey so far this afternoon, and that being that computerized neurocognitive tests, the same as any other concussion test per se, can provide important data for the clinician to consider informing the diagnostic, the differential diagnoses and your diagnostic formulation. But these tests are not designed to, quote, diagnose concussion. As it relates to day of injury, it's probably situational constraints that most limit the use of computerized neurocognitive tests on the day of injury, particularly on the sideline in the competitive sporting environment. I think perhaps the next generation that we'll see coming forward is the confluence of advanced technology meeting the situational constraints of the competitive sporting environment. And that is the use of handheld devices, the use of tablets and others that allow transport of the computerized technology platform to your pocket, to your injury kit that can be actually administered on the sideline, on the side of the pitch, rink side, etc., that would allow us to capitalize on some of the advantages of computerized technology, but also don't change the climate a great deal for the clinician and his or her independence in the sporting environment. I'm going to thank you for your attention.